but that 88 is pulling away.
Earnhardt, Johnson, Menard, Blaney, third-generation star, Dale Earnhardt Jr. brings him to the flag. Checkered flag, waving, it's over. It's Earnhardt. Earnhardt trying to cover all spots.
Oh, yeah! Good job, Junebug.
Dale Earnhardt Jr. Checkered flag at Talladega.
Why is this one so much fun? Because your grin told so many stories on your cool-down lap.
It's just real emotional. I haven't won here in a long time. It was my daddy's birthday a couple days ago. Just real emotional, man.
My nerd road.
And welcome to it, Dale Jr. and NASCAR fans, as we preview Atlanta, look back a bit at the week that was at Daytona, and I'm getting excited, to say the least. I really didn't know what to expect in Daytona last weekend, and even going into the race, and it's like this for me every single year. You know, Daytona is such the oddball one. I mean, it is the biggest race of the season, and as the announcers are so quick to point out, you know, it's our Super Bowl to kick the season off, right? But because of that fact, and because of the fact that it's a restrictor plate race, and it's the start of the season, it carries a different vibe to it. I usually look at, as I talked about on last week's podcast, I usually look at Atlanta to really start to get a gauge on how these teams are actually doing. And I think there are several things, positive things you can take away from Daytona. But even going into the race, you know, I had this funny feeling, for no good reason, really. It was probably just more of a defense mechanism, so I didn't get too disappointed. I just had this funny feeling that the day wasn't going to go the way that we had hoped. You know, the car was obviously really good. The team and Greg Ives had all ensured that the car wasn't going to have the same issues that they had last year and the same issues that Jimmy Johnson was dealing with all weekend, where it was just getting, you know, it was so loose coming off the corner that they couldn't keep the wheels out from under it, which is the problem that plagued Dale Jr. on the restrictor plate races before he ended up, you know, going out with his concussion injuries. You know, and the car was solid. And, you know, certainly in retrospect, there's no reason why Dale Jr., if he hadn't gotten swept up in that wreck, couldn't have and wouldn't have had a legitimate shot at the end of that race. The end of that race was ridiculous. I didn't really enjoy the Daytona 500, and not just because Dale Earnhardt Jr. wrecked out, but because I just didn't appreciate all the wrecking that was going on, and I didn't like the fact that at the end of it, it ended up coming down to a fuel mileage issue, and Kurt Busch ends up just kind of walking away with it. I thought it was just a horrible ending to the day. I'm not going to put any of the changes that NASCAR has implemented this year into, you know, use that as an excuse or to blame that for what we saw in the Daytona 500. I just think it was just one of those races where everybody was wrecking. If you were going to point to anything, I think you could point to the new rules package on the cars that made it more difficult to drive, and the guys just hadn't quite figured it out yet. But, you know, sometimes races just go down like that. Sometimes we end up having restrictor plate races at Daytona and Talladega where there's hardly any wrecks, and they end up just riding single file all day long. So, you know, it was a bummer. It was a bummer way to start the season, especially as a Dale Jr. fan, wanting him to return. I mean, thankfully he wasn't hurt in the wreck. Thankfully, it wasn't because of anything that he did. It wasn't because of the car. It was just a stupid racing incident that he got swept up into. And while I was disappointed, I just had this funny feeling in the back of my mind that, you know what, I'm not going to get my expectations too high on this race, and I'm going to look to Atlanta before I really, you know, begin to sort of set what my expectations are going to be for Dale Jr. He came out of that race with a positive attitude. If you heard any of the comments that he made on the Dirty Mo Radio podcast, the weekly Dale Jr. download that he is now hosting, you'll know that, you know, he's got a really, really good attitude right now. And he wasn't injured in the wreck. He does, he can do tests now. He actually did an eye test on himself in the race car when they were sitting under the red flag before they decided to go and pull the car into the garage, just because it was too risky to keep him out there. And for those that didn't hear it, basically the eye test is to know if he's suffering from a concussion. One of the things that they do is if you if you take your finger, let me see if I can describe this correctly. If you take your finger, and I'm going to do it right now while we're talking, and you put it straight out in front of you, right? So you just see your finger. Eventually, as you put your finger closer and closer to your eyes, eventually your finger will split in two as your eyes try to adjust to focusing on the end of your finger, right? As the closer you get, eventually you're going to see the finger go and split in two. That should happen. The very tip of your finger shouldn't split until you're about 1.5 inches or so off your face between your eyes. If it splits further out, and we're talking just the tip, not the back part of your finger. If it splits further out from your face, then that's an indication that you may have suffered a concussion. And apparently, when they went to test not only it at Darlington, but also in Phoenix, Dale Jr. had his concussion specialist, his doctor, with him, and that was one of the tests that they did after runs. Was they did this finger test and made sure that the distance hadn't changed, knowing that he had recovered from his concussion. So, thankfully, and we got an indication of that with the new rules now, where if you get into a wreck when you go to the infield care center and they check you out, they do NASCAR has implemented an immediate concussion test. So I know when Dale Jr. got into the wreck and we were all waiting for the post-wreck interview, I was really nervous about what he was going to say coming out, and thankfully he didn't have any kind of issue. And let's just pray that that's the only thing he ends up dealing with this year. I know it's not going to be, but I want Dale Jr. to be in the race car as long as he wants to be in the race car and not forced to come out of the race car because of his health. That's what I pray happens for him. I know that he's probably only going to race for a few more years, but I want him to be able to race as long as he wants on his own terms. So, again, the good news coming out of Daytona is that they fixed the car. They don't have the restrictor plate issues anymore. He was absolutely competitive. He walked away from that wreck, even though it was such a... With all that being said, it makes it very, sort of bittersweet. Not really sweet at all, really. But it makes it a bummer way to start the season. The good news is, heading into Atlanta, things are looking up in a big, big way. So before we preview Dale Jr., how the car is, qualifying and practice, there's a couple of other things I want to run through. First, talking about Atlanta in and of itself. Love Atlanta. If you listened to the podcast last year, you'll know I used to live in Atlanta. I've gone to many races there. Back when they were doing 2 races a year there, for a couple of years, I went to both races every year. I've actually had a chance to drive on that track, not only in my own personal car, but I also did the Richard Petty driving experience once there. And I also raced because I was doing talk radio at the time. For those that are just now listening to the podcast, I'm a news talk show host full-time here in Minneapolis. I host a morning show, Justice and Drew, along with our producer Samantha, on Twin Cities News Talk, and you can get more information on that if you follow me on Twitter at John, Jon Justice, or if you go to TwinCitiesNewsTalk.com. But for a number of years, back in the early 2000s, early 2000, I lived in Atlanta and went to that race several times a year, and so I actually got a chance to race. There's a little oval Legends car track on the front stretch. When you watch the race on Sunday, or if you're watching the race today, I'm recording this on Saturday. If you're watching the truck race or the Xfinity race today, when you see them come across the start-finish line on the front stretch, you can actually see it goes on to pit road. There's a little oval track there that goes on to the front stretch by the start-finish line, and then it wraps around onto pit road. I've actually had a chance to race a Legends car there a couple times, which was a lot of fun. Those Legends cars were just an absolute blast to drive. But Atlanta is going to be resurfacing. The track's worn out, and while the drivers like it, and it provides a lot of character, and it wears the tires out, they can only run on that for so long before it just starts coming apart. So Atlanta's going to have to resurface, and this is the last race they're going to run on the old surface. Now, that's going to mean that for the next couple of races that we have there over the course of the next few years, it's going to be drastically different, probably not nearly as good. Atlanta is a stupid fast racetrack, especially when the track surface has a lot of grip in it, just because of the banking of it. I mean, you can almost keep it wide open. You can't right now on the track because it's so worn out. But when I think the trucks actually and I'll find out later today. But I actually think the trucks are pretty close to running wide open there, especially when they get a lot of rubber down and it fills in all those sandpaper grooves. But we're looking at a beautiful weather this weekend, which you can't always say when we go to Atlanta. The forecast looks great. It's clear skies tomorrow. It's going to be cooler. All the rubber laid down in all three series with practice, with qualifying, and the races being run today means that the tire wear won't be nearly as bad, but the track is going to be fast and it's going to be slick. And I think we're in for a really, really good, non-restrictor plate season opener on Sunday. Now, speaking of which, Atlanta qualifying the surface. An article popped up today that I wanted to share with you, and this comes out of motorsport.com, NASCAR editor Jim Utter. It's pretty interesting. Dale Jr. says he's already overachieved this weekend. This is a different Dale Earnhardt Jr. And again, I don't know what that's going to mean. And I talked about this, again, last week a bit in the season opener for the podcast when previewing Daytona. I don't know what this is necessarily going to mean for Dale Jr. on the track. I'd like to believe that it means that he is going to run well. Certainly everything we've seen so far this weekend is an indication of that. But he seems more relaxed. He seems more complete. And there is an argument to be made that because of that maybe he will retire sooner because he wants to have a family with Amy, and he's now succeeded in finding a partner for life, and he's come out of the backside of this concussion, and it's offered new perspective. I know for me personally, I'm 44 years old, and 8 years ago I had a heart attack and I had to have open heart surgery. I had to have a bicuspid valve on my heart, an aortic valve, and that's because you're born with your aortic valve has 3 flaps, and that's what regulates the blood flow right from out of the heart and into the rest of your body. I was born with the birth defect. I only had 2. I didn't know that until I had a heart attack and they discovered it. It turns out that that'll only function so well before blood clots will form and that valve will throw off those blood clots and get stuck in your arteries, and that's what gave me my heart attack. On top of that, my blood pressure and the valve had created an ascending aortic aneurysm. So basically it was an enlarged aortic aneurysm attached. My aorta was enlarged, attached to that birth defect heart valve. So they had to put a graft in, and I had to have open heart surgery. And then a couple years later, it turned out that the graft had a leak in it, and I had to go back in and have it done again. So I've had that happen twice. So I only bring this up because in a very small way, I know a part of what Dale Jr. is probably feeling, in that he had to go through a traumatic experience with a lot of question marks attached to it, but he's come out on the backside of that, and it changes you. And it changes you in very positive ways, and it changes you in very negative ways. And I think for Dale Jr., having succeeded in dealing with his concussion, having married this wonderful woman in Amy, I imagine that he's feeling a lot of personal success in life outside of the race car. Which, and again, this is me kind of psychoanalyzing this and doing a lot of expectation. If I ever had a chance to interview him, I would love to ask Dale Jr. this question. But I wonder what that means for him and his desire for success on the racetrack. There is something to be said that it would be very positive and that he succeeded all these places in life, and this is what he wants to achieve now, which may be why he made the comment that if he ended up winning, say, the championship this year, he would seriously consider retiring maybe earlier. Or maybe that means that he's relaxed, wants to just go out and have fun, do the best job he can, but it doesn't mean it's not the end of the world if he ends up like Mark Martin and never wins a championship. All I know is that the Dale Jr. that we're seeing now is a much different Dale Jr. He is a happy Dale Jr. He seems to be a very content Dale Jr. So if you take that and then apply it to what we're seeing in the race car so far, just now heading into the second race of the season, I think that Dale Jr. is poised to have a lot of success. And that's more evidence-based than it is me and sort of my gut. My gut also tells me my gut tells me he's going to have a good season, but I think there is also something to be said that perhaps he will retire sooner and, even to, I hate to say it, but maybe even not run